Hello, welcome back to our next mini lesson in chapter 12. This video is going to cover the structural and functional classification of neurons, the anatomy of a neuron, and how there's different structural types, and then there's different functional types. So we're just going to jump right in. So first of all, we're going to take a look at the general parts and pieces of a typical, what we call a multipolar neuron, which is one of the structural classifications. So this is all of this, these terms are just listed here in the notes. I'm just going to run through that with this diagram and then some of the other ones as we kind of look at some of the details. So there's kind of three major regions of a neuron. So we have kind of the cell body part, right? So cell body, sometimes it's called a soma. You might see that word. We have the axon, which is the long, skinny extension or process. We use the word process when we talk about things that kind of branch off of stuff. And then we have the telodendria or the synaptic terminals. So those are the three major regions. So I'm going to kind of go on each one a little bit. So the cell body, if we take a look at it, we've got a lot of leader lines. The most obvious structural component of the cell body, besides the big nucleus, which kind of indicates that that's where we're looking at as a cell body, are the dendrites. Dendrite means branches, okay? So all of these branchy things that are coming off of the cell body, these are all dendrites, and dendrites are only found associated with the cell body, okay? So then within the cell structure itself, we have the nucleus and the nucleolus. That's typical of regular old, eukaryotic cells. We have Golgi bodies. We have part of the cytoskeleton called neurofilaments. It's just components of the cytoskeleton. And then we have some rough endoplasmic reticulums, which we call specifically Nissl bodies, which is the rough ER. Just like we had sarcoplasmic reticulum was a special name for smooth ER in muscles, the Nissl bodies are a special name for the rough ER in neurons, okay? So then those are all the components of the cell body. So the dendrites, the nucleus, nucleolus, neurofilaments, Golgi, there's mitochondria in there, right? So it's a typical eukaryotic cell with some special characteristics, primarily those dendrites. Then we take a look at the axon. We're going to take a look at just this very beginning part here, kind of this funnel-shaped structure. This is called the axon hillock. Hillock means little hill. So I guess it kind of looks like a little hill. So it's this extension coming off of the cell body that's eventually going to become the axon. And then right after that, there is a tiny little segment of membrane. I'm just going to highlight it green here. This is called the initial segment of the axon. That's going to come into play when we start doing the physiology of action potentials. Okay, so we have the axon hillock kind of coming off of the cell body. We have our initial segment of the axon, and then we have the entire length of the axon. Goes all the way down until it starts branching. So this is what we call the axon. The plasma membrane that covers the axon is just called the axolemma. Kind of like we had the sarcolemma for the muscle fiber plasma membrane. The plasma membrane over the axon is called the axolemma. Okay, so that's the middle part. That's the axon that branches away from the cell body and usually travels long distances, especially in the peripheral nervous system. And then we have our end part. And now there's a couple different names for this, and I'm not super picky on the names. Your textbook calls them telodendria. I think the lab manual might call them synaptic terminals. Here's axon terminals, are just these little knobs. Sometimes they're called synaptic knobs. So just, telodendria, synaptic terminals, synaptic knobs, all of those are okay in my book as far as describing the branchy end of the neuron that's going to be communicating with the neighboring cell. All right, so that's the general anatomy of multipolar neuron. Now, a couple words I wanted to highlight before we move away from the slide is we have to start understanding the relationship between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic cell. So the synapse, we saw synapse in chapter 10, the neuromuscular junction. The presynaptic cell in that case was the motor neuron. The postsynaptic cell was the muscle. And that's true. That's totally true. We are just seeing the presynaptic cell as being a neuron and the postsynaptic cell as being a neuron because there's a lot of neural circuits where it's neuron to neuron to neuron. It doesn't always have to be neuron to muscle. It could be neuron to gland even. So the presynaptic cell would be the neuron, the postsynaptic cell would be a gland, right? Because those are our effectors. skeletal muscle in the somatic nervous system, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands in the autonomic nervous system. So those are the effectors, which also serve as the postsynaptic cell. So keep that in mind as we progress through. Presynaptic is the cell that's communicating at the synapse. The postsynaptic cell is going to be receiving the signal of what's being released at the synapse. Okay, so here's just a close-up view of that synaptic knob. So again, here they're showing telodendria is the little branch. The synaptic knob is the actual big blobby knob thing. And it is in the synaptic knob where we have the synaptic vesicles. They're jam-packed full of neurotransmitter. In chapter 12, we learned that as acetylcholine was a neurotransmitter for skeletal muscle activation. There's a ton of different types of neurotransmitters. We're going to see primarily acetylcholine, but next term we'll start seeing epinephrine and norepinephrine and a few other signaling molecules. But no matter what they are going to be packaged up in these little synaptic vesicles waiting for the signal to release across the synaptic cleft. So again, here's the cleft. It's just that physical space between the presynaptic membrane, which is part of the presynaptic cell, and the postsynaptic membrane, which is part of the postsynaptic cell. So here we're just looking at the membrane of the pre and the postsynaptic cells. Okay. All right, so now we can take a look at some various types of neurons, structural types. So the one we just took a look at is this guy over here, multipolar. So when we talk about multipolar, or the polarity, if you will, of a structural classification of neurons, we're looking at how many branches, how many things are sticking off of the cell body. So if I'm going to kind of just draw a circle around the cell body, that's not a very good circle. But if then I were to draw a line to where everywhere there is a branch coming off, there's one big one for the axon, and then there's multiple branches coming off for the dendrites, we have multiple branches. So this is called multipolar. Okay? It's all about what's happening off of the cell body when we name these types of neurons. If we do the same thing for this guy here, a little bit better of a circle, how many branches are coming off directly from the cell body? Well, there's just one. It splits right away, but really there's just one branch coming off of that cell body. So we call this a unipolar neuron. If we do that over here, okay, we circle the cell body, we have one branch on that side and one branch on that side. So this is going to be a bipolar neuron because it's got two branches. Okay. And then we don't really talk about this one too much. I'll mention it just because it's here. You might say, hey, well, that looks like it could be a multipolar neuron, right? And these are called anaxonic. An is a prefix, it means not, like it doesn't have any. It's not so much that this doesn't have an axon, it does, but would you be able to tell which one is the axon and which ones are the dendrites? No, because they all look the same. So these ones are relatively rare. They're only found in the brain in very special neural circuits. Bipolar neurons are also relatively rare. They're typically only found in special senses. We'll see them again in vision, in your eyeball, and olfaction in your nose. Unipolar and multipolar are definitely way more dominant in our peripheral nervous system. And multipolar is very common in our brain as well. So multipolar, the most common type of neurons, that's typically why we use it as a model. And then unipolar are also very common. They are peripheral sensory neurons. So they are the ones that are bringing information from the periphery towards the CNS. Multipolar neurons in the peripheral nervous system function mainly as motor neurons, so sending signals away. So if you can think of unipolar as mainly sensory, multipolar's functionality is mainly motor. All right, so that's the structural classifications of neurons. And then we have functional classification. So what kind of information are these neurons carrying? So we just identified unipolar as being sensory, right? So this blue neuron here, and we can see it's unipolar. It's got its little cell body kind of off to the side with that one process. These are called afferent or sensory neurons. Because, oops, there we go. Afferent, if you remember, means coming towards. So a neuron that's carrying information towards the CNS will be an afferent neuron. The red, on the other hand, this one, since it's doing motor commands, it's multipolar. I know it's not really showing its dendrites up here, but I can draw those in. okay, multipolar. So these are also called efferent neurons. Motor neurons, efferent neurons, totally fine. Sensory or afferent neurons, totally fine. So sensory is carrying information towards the CNS. Motor is carrying information away from the CNS. And then we have other kind of in between. You have two names for this as well. You can call them association neurons because they associate between the sensory information coming in and the motor information going out. Or sometimes they're called interneurons because they're in between the sensory information coming in and the motor communication going out. So those are our functional classifications of neurons. Okay, so that wraps up our lesson on anatomy of a neuron and the different classifications structurally and functionally. I will see you next time. Bye.